Well, I guess you guys really want underrated fantasy recommendations, so here's some more. Hey friends, welcome back to my channel, and today we are doing a part 2 of my underrated fantasy recommendations video because when I did it a few months ago, you guys really liked that video. It's my second most viewed video of all time on my channel, which, first of all, thank you for that. Also, I think it went to show me just how much people are looking for those underrated fantasy gems, because honestly, I know we've talked about this on BookTube how many times in how many videos, but there are a lot of the same fantasy books and series that get recommended over and over and over, and a lot of those are kind of at the top of the marketing chain when it comes to bookstores and publishing companies, and a lot of the most amazing fantasy books fly under the radar and are covered up by the trends and the marketing of big dollar publishing houses. So I am taking it upon myself today to fill your TBR with 10 more recommendations of fantasy books by traditionally published authors, by indie published authors, all around amazing fantasy books that I have read and loved, and I hope you will find something on this list to add to your TBR that might even become a brand new favorite. We're gonna start off with one of my absolute favorite indie fantasy novels of all time, and even better, look how tiny this is, you guys. I know that you guys are always looking for palate cleansers, you guys are always looking for short reads that you can jump into, enjoy over a weekend or over a day if you're that kind of reader. And one of my favorite books ever in indie fantasy is Seasons of Albadone by Chris Warman and Elan Marche. This is a husband and wife author couple who have figured out the perfect formula to working together incredibly well to write good stories, because this little book, you guys, is divided into 4 episodes, each one represented by a season, and this world is so Grimm's fairy tales with a dash of Studio Ghibli, and it's darker than the cover suggests. Don't go into this expecting a cozy fantasy, but it's so well done. The world has this living, breathing feel to it, and each one of the episodes is tied together through the same locale and some things that happen within each of those episodes. This story really showcases choices that human beings make and the repercussions of those on other people, on the world around them, and they're so bite-sized and emotionally impactful. I'm always impressed when authors can take a short number of pages and bring such an emotional punch to what they are writing within that short amount of pages, and Marche and Warman definitely do that in Seasons of Albadone. Now this is book 1 in a series called The Eighth Chant. There are a couple of other books out in the series that are a little bit longer than this one. You can read this and decide if you want to continue on in the series, and whether you do or not, this little book by itself will leave you thinking about it a long time after you close the pages. The next incredibly unique fantasy novel that I'm going to be holding up for you guys is Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. We are going to the other end of the page count spectrum from Seasons of Albadone because this one is a little bit of a chunk. However, it does read very quickly. This is a bingeable, standalone fantasy novel about a woman named Emily Marshwick. Now, this story takes place in a flintlock fantasy world meets a little bit of Jane Austen. Like if you took Lizzie Bennet out of Pride and Prejudice and threw her into a flintlock fantasy, this book would be close to that. Emily Marshwick is a phenomenal fantasy heroine. She is not a 16-year-old girl. She is in her 20s. She's a little bit more mature. And what happens is her country's at war, and the soldiers go off to war to fight this terrifying foe that there's a ton of rumors about throughout her country. And then the older men have to go off to war. and then the younger men have to go off to war, and then there's nobody left to send to the front lines, and Emily herself is called in to the battle. So she takes up her flintlock musket and goes off to war. Now, this book does spend a lot of time with Emily and her family, so you really get a sense of these characters and the stakes and what these people mean to Emily and why she chooses to be the one to take up arms and go off to war to protect her house. And once she gets to the war, the combat that Adrian Tchaikovsky writes and the way that this frontline experience for Emily happens is just so good. It's so well written. I have a couple minor quibbles with it, but other than that, this book is so good. If you want something that has this kind of political, military background with some really solid non-traditional fantasy hero character work going on, this book is so good. Another thing about this book is that if you enjoy a little bit of a romantic subplot in your fantasy without letting that romantic subplot take over the rest of the novel, this is a great book for you because there is a romantic thread throughout the story that I actually really enjoyed. Plus, again, it is a standalone, and it can be read pretty quickly, super accessible, super bingeable. Emily Marchwick is the heroine that fantasy didn't know it needed, and I hope that you enjoy her story as much as I do. Next up, we're going to go towards the thieving and heisting side of fantasy with a dash of murder mystery. And I'm going to recommend The Blood of Crows by Alex C. Pierce. This is also on my favorite indies list so far that I've read. And this follows Ren, who is a thief. He's very highly trained, but he is in a world where people have magic and he doesn't. And when there is a series of non-traceable murders that happen in this city, Ren becomes a prime suspect, and so he is against the clock trying to not only outrun his pursuers who are convinced he is a murderer, but he also has to slowly unravel the truth behind what is happening, why these people are dying, and how he can stop the person that is actually behind them. This has a lot of high stakes. It is very fast-paced, great action. I love Ren as a main protagonist character. There are some fantastic side characters with great relationships within it, and the murder mystery of this book is one of my favorite things about it because I love the genre mashup of fantasy meets murder mystery or fantasy meets thriller kind of vibes. And I think that this book does a really good job taking that murder mystery, nestling it into a fantasy world really, really well. Highly recommend this. I know it is one of 2 books in the series currently out. I have not read the second book yet. I'm hoping to get to that very soon. But this first book by itself, I absolutely love the reveals, the payoffs, the characters, the murder mystery. So good. So good. Highly recommend this if you're looking for that particular blend of fantasy. Now, if you like retellings, but you want them to be well written, you want them to be really gritty and have a dash of horror, and you want them to make you completely rethink the way you have always thought about a certain tale, I have a recommendation for you. And that is Lost Boy by Christina Henry. This is one of my favorite quote-unquote YA novels of all time. I say quote-unquote because it's pretty dark for a YA novel. It is very gritty, it is very dark, and it tells the story of Peter Pan like it has never been told before. James Hook is a boy in this story alongside Peter, and it kind of gives us an origin tale of the feud that exists between them. Now, what I found really fascinating about this book, besides the fact that the horror elements are so seamlessly integrated into the fantastic story of Neverland, it also completely reframed the way that I think about Peter Pan's character. Not just because it's one of those stories that tries to make the villain sympathetic or anything like that. I felt like it was telling the story in a completely fresh, new way. And it is really at its heart an exploration of narcissism and self-centeredness and what kind of damage that can cause to yourself and the people around you, the world around you. And it is just so well written. This book is perfect for adult fantasy readers who want something that is fast, bingeable, and gives a good punch of horror through the fantasy. It is so good. The creatures in here are absolutely terrifying. The way that the characters develop through the story is phenomenal. It just kind of gives me all of the vibes that I always want from a retelling and never actually get. Highly recommend this one. I think it is well worth your time putting it on a TBR. Now, if we want to go a little bit more towards the literary side of fantasy, I'm going to recommend A Green and Ancient Light by Frederic S. Durbin. I have talked about this on my channel quite a few times before, but it is still a very underrated fantasy book. Again, quick read, not very long. It is a standalone. This one gives me Pan's Labyrinth meets a little bit of Narnia meets literary fiction. It is the story of a young boy who is staying with his grandmother during a war, and there is this kind of mystical garden at the top of this hill behind her house, and there are all of these statues in the garden, and they're very mysterious. There's a lot of rumors that have been spread around them, and there is a person that this boy and his grandmother end up having to take care of and hide. And the garden itself has such a magical realism kind of feel to it. It is a much more bright and green version of Pan's Labyrinth, if that makes sense. Take some of the horror out of that. But it is just such a fascinating read. It definitely leans more towards the literary side of things. I would highly recommend this for anybody who read Piranesi and enjoyed it. I do think that this kind of leans that direction a little bit more. Not the same story by any means, but I do think that it is kind of in that same vein. I read this book years ago when I first started BookTube, and it has stayed on my shelf, and I keep thinking about it years later. And I definitely wanted to include this on the list because I almost never hear anybody talking about this book, and I definitely think it should be on more people's TBR. Next up, if you are an anime fan, if you are an Asian-inspired fantasy fan, if you like some really intricate, interesting magic and fiery action, I am going to recommend Pawn's Gambit by Rob J. Hayes. Now, I love the Mortal Techniques series, which this is a part of. This is technically book 2, but the best part about these books is that they can be read as standalones. Its first book is Never Die, the third book is Spirits of Vengeance. I have read all 3 and love all 3 of these books. But the reason why I wanted to pull out Pawn's Gambit specifically out of these 3 is because I think it has one of the most interesting magic/combat systems of the 3 books. Spirits of Vengeance is technically my favorite, but Pawn's Gambit, the more I think about it, the more fascinated I am with what Rob J. Hayes was able to create within the antagonist of this story, the magic system, the characters. It's just such a tightly plotted, really interesting story with fantastic characters in it. Now, this story follows a character named Yu, who was a military strategist for a prince until one wrong move cost her and her liege lord everything. Now, she has a kind of magic that utilizes basically chess pieces. It is very, very cool the way that it's set up. And it has a little bit of a steampunk vibe. There is a like steam engine aspect to the antagonist, one of the antagonists in this story. And I don't want to say too much more than that because honestly, the best way to find out what I'm talking about is to read it for yourself. Our protagonist spends basically this entire book coming up against thieves, assassins, and remnants of the war that she participated in prior to this book, and just basically high stakes, can she survive? The way that Rob J. Hayes writes combat with magic is so interesting and well done, and I definitely think that this book will heavily appeal to people who enjoy Asian martial arts films, shonen anime without all of the filler episodes, and people who just like well done characters, interesting world building, and fascinating magic systems. If you want to read a standalone fantasy novel that makes you feel like you are reading classic literature with all of the high stakes and heroism of fantasy, I want to recommend to you To Ride Hell's Chasm by Janny Wurts. This book, again, is a standalone, so you can taste test her work as an author, and you'll hear this about Janny's work everywhere on BookTube if you've come across it before, and that is that her writing, her prose is so elevated and has a intentional tone behind every phrase, every word that is chosen. And yet, with that elevated prose is a fantastic classic fantasy tale. In this story, a princess goes missing and is kidnapped right before her wedding banquet, and dark shadows are creeping over the land that she leaves behind. When the princess disappears, a guard captain named Mikhail is tasked with finding out where she went, who took her, and how to get her back. Now, the problem with this is that Mikhail is facing a lot of prejudice from the people around him because of where he comes from, because of his past history, and because of his ethnicity. And so he is trying to do his investigation amidst a lot of pushback at every turn. Now this becomes even more high stakes when Mikhail himself becomes the object of scrutiny from other people who are aiding in the investigation. And he sets off on his own to find the princess himself. Now, this book is surprisingly bingeable for how elevated the prose is. And I definitely think if you are looking for something that has a really well-written, well-crafted, masterful classic fantasy feel, this book is definitely going to give you that. Now, if you've been around my channel for a while, this next recommendation is not going to be a surprise to you, but I am going to mention it again because more people need to read this. If you are a character-driven reader and you love really subtle, deeply fleshed out worlds, magic systems, and character development that takes place over a long period of time, I am going to recommend The Shadow of Summer, which is the first book in the Long Price Quartet. Now, one of the cool things about the series, completed series, is that in this omnibus edition is all 4 of the books in the quartet, which is super cool because this one book is usually the size of the first book in a series for fantasy. And what I love about it so much is that Daniel Abraham packs into these 4 books a masterclass of balance in fantasy. The character development and the consequences of their actions throughout a lifetime of decisions is laid out in such an incredibly engaging way. His prose is so beautiful. It is the kind of writing that will have you rewinding and going back over and over again to reread a passage, reread some dialogue. The magic system is hands down probably the most unique magic I have ever read in a fantasy book, and it surrounds the idea of words being made manifest, but there's only a certain type of people that can actually manage to do this without massive devastation. There are so many things I could say about this series to recommend it to you, but this is definitely a quartet of books that I recommend for people that want to take a step further into fantasy, that want to try something that leans a little bit literary, but is just such an incredible elevated masterclass on how to write a series of books that makes use of every single moment, every single word. There is not a single ounce of wasted space in this series, and it is so good. I bawled my eyes out at the end of this series and at several points during the series because these characters became so near and dear to my heart throughout their journey that I was thinking about this book and had a serious book hangover long after I finished the last page. The next book on my list is going to give you some hero party vibes, some classic dwarves, elves, and orcs kind of fantasy, and that is Orconomics by Zachary Pike. Now, I think a lot of people are put off by the idea of fantasy satire, which I can completely understand because I was too. I was actually really apprehensive going into this book. However, boy was I surprised. He's literally taking pot shots at classic fantasy archetypes, classic fantasy tropes, and economics. And what I loved about this story is that It really gave me everything I wanted from a hero party story without making it something that I had read before, without something that felt super cliched. It really leans in to the unseriousness of it while also subtly riding that line of including deeper themes for those of us who want that in a story that makes us laugh. Now, this is the story of a dwarf named Gorm Ingerson who is a bit down on his luck, and he is a has-been hero. Now, Gorm is busy trying to drown his sorrows when a chance encounter sets him on a path to a mission that he doesn't have any say in. He's basically blackmailed into a mission and put together with a motley crew, which forms, of course, the hero party, that is sent off to do a specific task. They are led by a very naive and hapless priest who I absolutely loved. He was a great addition to the hero party, and this whole story had so much heart and so much it was such a fun story, and I love fantasy books that surprise me, and this one definitely did. I will say though, prepare yourself for some tearjerker moments in amongst all of the laughs. And last but not least, I know that if you've been around my channel for a while, you have heard me mention this book many times at this point. However, I know that these videos reach a much wider audience than my usual videos do, and so I wanted to be sure and include it on here because more people need to be reading this book. And that is By Blood, by Salt by J.L. Odom. This was the winner of the self-published fantasy blog-off competition this last year and deserved every single inch of that accolade because it is a masterfully written book. This is the kind of story that I recommend for readers who love character-driven, light magic fantasy novels. This one's heavy on the alternate history feel, lighter on the really deeply explained and present magic system. But Jamie Odom is an absolute master when it comes to character development. She does something with a specific character in this novel that is one of the most brilliant things I have seen in character writing in fantasy in the last few years. I absolutely loved it. Her experience as a military veteran and translator is on full display in this novel. The world building is so vibrant. The descriptions of the environments are so vibrant. The main character is that underdog fighting prejudice and oppression character that we all know and love, but with a twist, with a side cast of incredibly detailed, interesting characters, with an antagonist that you never quite know what's going on with. There's so much to love in this book. The second book is also out, A Haunt for Jackals, and the third book should be coming out hopefully in the next year. And this easily makes my top fantasy series of all time. It is on my top 10 fantasy series list, and I just think more people need to try this book because it is phenomenal. It is one of those books where you walk in to this story and immediately you know that you are in the hands of someone who really loves their craft, and that is such a fun experience as a reader. I would love to know what you think are some underrated fantasy gems down in the comments below, so please let me know what you would put on an underrated fantasy list. Let me know if you've read any of these books, what you think of them. I would love to hear. Also, let me know if any of these tickle your fancy and you end up adding them to your TBR. If you do, I hope you have a phenomenal time with them and that they end up being a new favorite read for you. Also, go down in the description box below for all of my links to other social media platforms and also my website where you can find my fantasy novels. I have an urban fantasy series, an epic fantasy series, and a fantasy western series all started, and I am absolutely loving being in all three of those worlds, and I hope that you are willing to give them a try as well. Other than that, I hope you guys are having a phenomenal week. I hope you are reading some 5-star reads, whether they're overrated, underrated, or somewhere in the middle, and I will see you in the next video.